your pardon. Middle age, they say, is when your broad mind and narrow waist trade places, but I think it's also where you either need really large font or glasses. I struck a balance this morning to save a tree, and I'll use my glasses at some stage, I think. Good, we're on, great. The topic that I've been assigned or been invited to speak to you on in these 90 minutes that I have, I don't claim any really special expertise in the world religions as such. My training was in Russian literature initially, Russian language, then literature. Then I went into theology, historical theology they call it. But through conversations and through opportunities to teach apologetics and world religions, I've been able to think about the Christian faith that I've embraced since I was a boy, and to get to know people in their various situations, very ordinary situations, in various parts of the world. My wife works with the Foreign Service, so apart from being raised in Mexico and being more or less on the go all my life, we continue to be on the go and getting to spend extended periods in different places. And the most recent long period was in India, and I must say I love the country. And if any of you here have that background, please know that I came really to enjoy your country and your culture, and I learned much while I was there as an apologist. So I think of knowing as fundamentally relational. We've used big words like epistemic and epistemology. Language is a gift. If you've ever read Walker Percy, Time in a Bottle, he's contemplating and meditating on the beauty and the wonder of language and of naming things. And so that's something of a thread that will run throughout my remarks in my two talks. If George Sinclair gets to talk to lots of people in coffee shops, well, most of my conversations in India were on trains. Whether we were talking about the life of Pi and how to understand it, or talking about meditation, spirituality, any number of things that would lead to significant discussions about the things that we're considering here today. These conversations have helped me immensely. I've learned, I think, a little bit more about listening first before I try to explain anything, because it's going to be obvious to you. You need to know where people are coming from. You need to make sure that you're addressing the question as it's, or the deep question, or as Ravi Zacharias says, the question behind the question. I've learned that no matter where you go, there's a great variety in religion and belief systems, and plenty of mixing and matching, so that it's never a simple conversation between Christian and Buddhist or Christian and Muslim. There's always a complexity about these conversations. And I've learned that people from all walks of life struggle with basically the same things. The same big questions about personal identity and purpose, grounds for believing this or that, a sense that things aren't right, whether out there in the world or possibly even inside me, and whether there's hope for the future. I've also encountered a general illiteracy among fellow Christians about what it is we actually believe. And that's everywhere. That's not just here, not just there. It's everywhere I've been. We are a bit weak. We are a bit weak in that department, and we do well to learn better what it is we believe in conversation with others. I've also encountered great openness to what I've had to say, some surprisingly interesting conversations with people in India where there were moments of light bulbs going on for both of us, but also indifference, as you'd expect, and sometimes hostility. Conversations are rarely dull. I can say that. Over the years, I've grown more and more convinced that there's nothing more compelling than the gospel that's centered on Jesus of Nazareth, his life, his ministry, his death, resurrection, and ascension, and his promise to come again. The whole Christ event, if you like. I think of apologetics in broad terms. Apologetics isn't just about defending the faith, it's about translating it, it's about commending it. Alistair McGrath is good on that particular way of looking at the task of apologetics. We don't face challenges only from people who aren't Christians. We face challenges from within, and I'm going to make that clear in the second talk. So to my task. There are two reasons, I think, why we might say or think that religions are all basically the same. John Hick, the famous philosopher, says, the world faiths seem to constitute more or less equally authentic human awarenesses of and responses to the ultimate, the real, the final ground and source of everything. Notice what the responses are to. A source that's more or less impersonally conceived, right? But all of these responses are, in his mind, authentic. Authenticity is key. That as long as we are authentic and we are sincere in our response to whatever we feel is ultimate, then we're more or less complementing each other in our quest for the truth, according to John Hick. The term for the kind of pluralism that he would teach us is called complementary for that reason. You've come across it with the parable of the elephant, right? Which is quite commonly used. I think, I'm not sure where it originated. Maybe you can tell me later if you know. But the point is quite clear, isn't it? That the various blind people here, they're all touching different aspects of the same elephant. And we have a clue here as to the problem. We already have a clue as to the problem with this kind of metaphor. I wonder if you've thought about that. It's not only the fact that somebody sees that we're talking about an elephant. It's not simply that. At any rate, I wouldn't send my dogs into that fight initially. I would rather look at what is the hypothesis exactly. Let's just allow that it's a hypothesis for a minute. I think the real problem has to do with what the person who's not blind actually sees. That everyone's religious knowledge is only partial and fragmentary, like pieces of a puzzle, and that everyone is working with the same puzzle. I think that's the more precise problem. But if we're generous and we say it's a hypothesis, well, we're working with that complementary pluralism. But of course, we have to ask, well, how do you know these things? Was this revealed to you that truth is the way you describe it? The second reason we might think that it really makes no difference which religion you follow is more postmodern, if that one was modern. Here our pluralism is more radical. It goes deeper. In other words, we say, scratch the puzzle, scratch the elephant, get rid of it. We can't ever have the big picture. We can't ever have the big meta story that makes sense of all stories. So we say, okay, maybe the religions are quite different, and maybe they're even heading in different directions. But then we add, but for all practical purposes, it doesn't really make a difference which religion you follow, as long as you're sincere and don't push your views on anyone else. You have to go with your heart, because there's really no knowing who's right. So that's a more postmodern approach. Well, what's the problem with that? Recall one of last night's questions. in a world of 10,000 religions, why does any one of them, or anything, as I recall, have to be the only way? Well, think about that question itself. Does it itself assume one way or many? I'd say one. Because, why is that? Well, because it's telling us that the way is that there should be many ways. And we're back to something like the elephant again. And we're going to have to grapple with what it is we think we know once again. There's no getting around some kind of way. We took a stab at it different ways, and I wondered if that might be helpful. In the second place, it's too detached from the moral and political implications of this or that belief system. It's an armchair approach. It relegates people's deep convictions about ultimate things, goodness, beauty, truth, to the realm of private opinion, so that any attempt to offer insights to someone else, let alone to learn from one another, is seen as imposing your values, of course, which we know here in fair Canada is impolite. In the end, the idea that there's no knowing who's right is something that's just taken for granted. A basic belief about the big picture, if you like. So we don't get very far, and then we find other more important things to talk about, or that we think are more important. Like if I'm around my cousins and good friends in Arkansas, we'll talk about guns and gadgets and whatever else. Maybe golf. So we may just need to take the religions more seriously. And I'm getting ready to launch in just a minute into those. In my 2 talks this morning, I propose to do that by looking at 3 basic common ways of approaching the big questions and how Christianity or biblical religion relates to them. But first, some assumptions. You see, I'm a typical academic. I've got to have a long prelude to what I want to say. On one level, here are my assumptions. On one level, religion naturally has a very individual dimension. In fact, 10,000 might be too small a number. I mean, it's a good number to set, right? But in one sense, it may be too small. Why? Well, in linguistic terms, and this is kind of my passion, in linguistic terms, you have languages, you have dialects, you might have subdialects, and you even have you heard it? Idiolects. That's your language. That's your particular language that you speak. If you and your significant other manage to communicate, it's because you've found some common space between your 2 idiolects, okay? The speech, the definition, the speech habits peculiar to a particular person. So I'm speaking in Steve right now. It happens to be a subgroup of English, right? Something like that. And I'm all messed up because I don't know where I started out. Well, I started out in Mexico in a British school, but that didn't quite stick. And so I think here in Ottawa, a lot of people think I'm from here, but maybe you would disagree. That's all beside the point. So too in the world of beliefs. I may be raised a Hindu, but as I go through life, the beliefs and the moral principles and ceremonies of what I've inherited will be modified. Well, they'll be adapted. I'll come up with something very much like my own religion. Having said that, of course, it's through those encounters in life that we necessarily try and work our way back at some point, if only to sort out where we've come from. And we ask, what exactly did I inherit? Is there a basic grammar to Hinduism? Well, some are going to object right away and say, the question of a basic grammar is far too simplistic. I've heard it in different forms. Hinduism, don't you know, is a Western umbrella term for the many beliefs and practices that came together for many people in India. But I would simply respond by saying that the basic grammar is to serve as a starting point, not something that covers every nuance. I recently found myself at a conference in Guatemala interpreting between English, Spanish, and Russian. And now there are multiple dialects in those languages. But that didn't mean I said, no, sorry, I can't do it. Right? On that basis, it would not make sense to say that I can't do it. I need to appeal to the contemporary standard versions of those languages in order to facilitate a conversation. I don't need to know all of the nuances of every dialect. Some raise a different objection. Well, I'm not really interested in worldviews or systems of ideas because I think we should just get on with life. We should just enter life and not worry about systems. Peter Rollins, I've watched some of his talks, he takes this view when he says, maybe faith, and he's from Ireland, maybe faith is about being freed from doctrines, and sorry, that sounded more Scottish, but about being freed from doctrines and belief systems. Maybe faith is about being freed from doctrines and belief systems. Well, what's the problem here? We smuggle in a worldview, a basic grammar of beliefs and behavior that we allow to guide us when we challenge the idea of doctrine and system. So my approach then is this, to try to understand each worldview from inside as much as we can. What are its merits? What motivates it? What's its basic grammar? With the ultimate aim of showing why the grammar of the Bible is more satisfying. So these are my hopes, that what I present today will help us take people more seriously, the complexity of each individual, his or her concerns, hopes, fears, the way they connect with what they think is true to what they think is right and good and beautiful. That it will help us to take the world of ideas more seriously in an age of dumbing down, shouting down, and self-censorship. And that it will help us to take ourselves more seriously, to look at our own assumptions from the outside, if you like. And this too is an art that we need to cultivate. And finally, that it will encourage us to consider the basic claims of biblical religion, biblical faith. So let's start in the land of enchantment. This painting is by a Russian named Nikolai Ryorich. He died in 1947. He had a passion for the East, for the Himalayas. He lived there extended periods, as far as I know. He was associated with a theosophist named Madame Blavatsky. He cultivated a sense of deep unity between, say, Buddhism, as represented here in the stupa, and an Orthodox monastery or a Christian monastery of some sort on the same side of the hill. What's the way in to the land of enchantment? Well, this might be one way, and let me invite you into this world as far as I can. In a world of noise and violence and cultural upheaval and exclusion, well, I find myself longing for silence, for stillness, for unity. Unity is displayed in this picture, in this painting. Harmony. In a world of so many particular beliefs and habits, all bound up with their own historical limitations, I ask myself if there isn't something universal underneath them all. As I contemplate the great circle of life, the way I'm embedded in the cosmos, here's the Pachamama from the Latin American imagination, or specifically South American, and very possibly, as I contemplate what's very possibly a nearly endless cycle of death and rebirth before I reach that tranquility and resolution that I hope is on the other side, I naturally start pursuing things that aren't, as far as I can tell, time-bound, subject to time and history. Time, it seems, is against me, and I want release from it. Does that sound familiar? In certain natural settings, I find myself almost hearing the music of nature, and the beauty I see resonates with a longing that's deep inside me. Even the harsh things command awe and respect. I suppose it was probably John Denver who would have led me in, right? I'm telling you my age, but I grew up listening to John Denver. He, to me, exemplifies that cool mountain morning with a bowl of granola and all things wholesome. And in fact, I got to meet him in Moscow in 1984 when he was there performing with Jim Henson, and they invited us, American students, to come to the U.S. ambassador's home and to hear and to meet John Denver and Jim Henson for a little Christmas get-together. Well, his song, check it out. Listen to his song, Wind Song. I'm not going to play it for you, but check it out sometime. See if that doesn't lead you into the land of enchantment. The wind is the whisper of our mother, the earth. The wind is, welcome the wind and the wisdom that she offers. Well, it's not hard to be led into the land of enchantment. How do I see reality if I'm an inhabitant of this land? What do I believe about what I see and what I don't see? Well, with a kind of mystical sense. By mystical, I mean direct or immediate sense, unmediated sense of reality as I receive it. I feel my unity with everything I see and what I don't see. And I come to see everything as one reality. Whatever it is that moves the sun and the moon and the seasons and the rain and the earth and the clouds, whatever gives a pattern to life as cycles of existence, well, this mystery, this unknown, is one of the same essence. If you want the Latin word, substance, right? Essence or being with all of life as I see it. Now, of course, not everything is of the same order. Higher things give birth to lower things, and so on. What is higher and invisible is more real than the visible things here below. In reverse, I take the things I see to be passing away, and I assume the things that I don't see are eternal. So how do I know this? Well, did someone tell me? Perhaps, but it's seen to be a deep knowing at the level of intuition. One gentleman that I met on a train one day in India, we had a 6-hour ride together, so we had a lot of time to talk. And we heard about galaxies yesterday from Dr. Lim. And this gentleman, through meditation, had experienced travel to other galaxies. And we got into an interesting conversation in which I said this to him. In my understanding, sir, he was an elderly man, God and the universe are essentially distinct. And then he said, yes, that's an insight that we gain on the way to a deeper truth. And what is that deeper truth, I asked? That their distinction is an illusion. And how do you know it's an illusion, I asked. Oh, I just know. I'm sorry, but how do you know that the essential unity between God and the world is not an illusion? I just know. Would you like to speak to my guru? He said. And I didn't take him up on that invitation, but I gathered that the knowing is this deep sense of intuition. There isn't in a sense what we would expect as some kind of further explanation or further ground that would ground that intuition. Truth in this world, in the land of enchantment, has no independent existence. And what do I mean by that? It doesn't come from beyond human resources. Truth, in a sense, is not from above. It only ever emerges from down here, from below, among us. Albert Einstein and Rabindranath Tagore in 1930 had a conversation, and this was part of it. And Tagore said, if there be any truth absolutely unrelated to humanity, then for us it is absolutely non-existing. And Einstein replied, then I'm more religious than you are. In other words, I'm not so sure about that. Fascinating. If we live in the land of enchantment, truth emerges on the way. How many of you know Spanish? Well, caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar, by the poet Antonio Machado. Brian McLaren has taken for his title of one of his more recent books, You Make the Road as You Walk It. And this speaks to an existentialist, if you like, approach to knowing, but it's what I call presentism. It situates us it situates our knowing strictly in a present moment. It's a sense of it values spontaneity in knowing. It's a little bit like heading into a roundabout in Lagos, Nigeria, where I live, where you just fly in and you just negotiate things once you're there. Truly, because there are no rules in the roundabout. But this is you discern truth as you go along. There's no caminante no hay camino. There's no way. The way is made as you walk it. As you look back in that poem, you don't see any solid ground at all. And as you look forward, the future is radically open. So there's no anchor either in the future or the past. You're in this eternal present moment that you're forced to live in. But of course, that begs all kinds of questions about what is the present, philosophically speaking. What is the present for us if we take Scripture as our narrative to help us understand time and history? The present is really a continuation of the past, right, with an anticipated future. Anyway, if we live in the land of enchantment, how do we understand the human problem or predicament? What's gone wrong, according to us? And how bad is it? How bad is our situation? Well, I suppose we might say that the patterns and habits we inherit can be harmful and toxic, right? We might say that certain attitudes work against unity and harmony. We might say our problem is with dualistic thinking. Richard Rohr, something of an inhabitant of the land of enchantment, pulled out this list of dualisms that we need to avoid. We need to avoid us, them, gay, straight, male, female, heaven, hell, right religion, wrong religion. You see, in the land of enchantment, we're very suspicious of binary thinking. And are we hopeful that we can address our problems? Well, yes, we can be quite hopeful. Since the problem is primarily out there in the world, we can address it through effort, through imagination, through creativity, through all sorts of good things that we can do to try and address our problems. We're essentially able to self-actualize, to realize our essential unity with reality and even the divine nature that is in us, if we can just find a way to fan it into flame. And what's the method? Well, you probably know this if you've read anything about Eastern practices of meditation, or perhaps have even practiced them yourself. But you cultivate an appreciation for sacred spaces. You meditate, you practice yoga. You might meditation being in Hindi Raja Marga, good works karma Marga. You might seek out a guide or a guru. You might seek to think good thoughts, jnana marga, aimed at liberating yourself to be freed from your historical limitations. So, just a few questions then. for ourselves as we live in this land of enchantment? Well, I think that, those toys where you bash those little frogs down or whatever, and then the others pop back up, I think that's what happens with the dualisms. I think as soon as you name a dualism, another one pops up. And one of the most basic dualisms is that pops up in the land of enchantment without noting it is time against eternity. Maybe this is the most basic. Here we drive a wedge between time and eternity, which in practice, ironically, means that they get confused. Sometimes, have you thought about that? When you actually separate things and distinguish them sharply, you end up confusing them. I wonder if you've thought about that. I don't know. I think about that kind of thing every now and then. Well, what happens here is that time gets collapsed into eternity. I think of some music that I've listened to, which goes by the term New Age music. And I find, even though I'm not a trained musician, I find that somehow I'm not able to stay with it because it doesn't take me anywhere. It just leaves me floating out there in space. Time becomes an illusion if time is collapsed into eternity. So, and if this is so, a couple of interesting and possibly very dangerous things follow. My behavior in time is secondary to decisions that have been made outside of time, in other words, fate. And I have no solid foundation for my behavior. I'm not saying I can't do good things and that I can't be kind and that I can't be considerate and I can't compose works of music at all. We talked about common grace yesterday. But I don't have a solid foundation for my behavior if decisions have been made somewhere else. Secondly, we can't mark time, which is to say we can't relate historical events to each other properly because we're left in a kind of, as I said, eternal now that makes the past meaningless. The second is dogma versus experience, which I mentioned in relation to Peter Rollins already. He smuggles in a grammar at the same time. He's just very vague about what that grammar is, and you kind of have to listen to him talk for a while before you figure out what his grammar is, because he is not in the business of making that very clear. Public-private. As the inner life is cultivated, salvation becomes a basically individual pursuit. Yes, you say, well, what about the need for a guru? Well, I might seek out a guru to guide me in my quest, but he's ultimately to be set aside. And salvation, being mainly about spiritual things, means that I often disregard public spaces. I'm less concerned about them because, after all, I'm not supposed to be too worried about what I see. And then fourthly, mind versus body. Mind and consciousness become something eternal. I think it was Deepak Chopra who says the only absolute is our consciousness, and it's a collective consciousness. And the body, of course, in that scheme is simply passing away. And so what's my response? Very briefly, I think that to name things, to classify things, is inherently dualistic. If you get in the business of talking, you're already going to practice some form of dualism or another, if you're going to name things. To say the God-creation distinction is an illusion, as my friend on the train said, is to name what is to give a name to what is. It's to say reality is one, not two or three or more. And that's dualistic because it's either or thinking. Either reality is one or it's more than one. You see what I'm saying? We cannot talk, we cannot classify, we cannot name things without practicing some form of dualism. It's in the mystery of language. It's right there in what it means to be human. A further question or two about the religious quest itself. How confident am I that I'm basically good, that I can achieve my potential? How do I relate that to my capacity for destruction? Secondly, can worship ever be misguided? Ravi Maharaj, in his book, The Death of a Guru, narrates how he was raised in a Brahmin family, raised to be a priest, and at some point in his training, he was looking in the mirror, and he said, "What keeps me from worshiping myself?" And that shocked the living daylights out of him, and he became a follower of Jesus. All right, I have another 10 minutes, and I'm going to take you into the city of disenchantment. I'd say, are there questions now? But sorry, it's not a lecture. So this is okay. All right, the city of disenchantment. Well, I already told you that I had the opportunity to live in Moscow when I was an undergraduate in 1984. And, well, what's the way into the city of disenchantment? I'm going to be brief with this, not because I don't know that much about it, but because it's a very straightforward approach. It's very sober. That's going to be ironic to those of you who've lived in Russia, where the drinking problem is a big problem. I usually manage to say, no thanks, I can't take that fourth shot of vodka, because I'm translating, I'm interpreting. Sorry if you, yeah. I also came to be very fond of Russia and Russians, so that is not a jab at Russians. That is just simply a jab at a bad habit, right, that we can all get into. If I want to show you the way into the land to the city of disenchantment, I could do it by saying, well, I've grown tired of the gods. And you even see this in India. You meet people who said, I'm tired of the gods. I feel the need to leave the land of mysticism and superstition, spells and incantations, and I feel the need to build a city that's based on reason. Not on things that we can't see, but things that we can see, things we can measure. I've also grown tired of the land of the gods. It's just far too disorganized. Their people's passion is for spiritual things, whatever that means. And so they don't really worry about all the garbage and the filth. And they're given to celebration more than things that are really useful. Their worship is all in your face, and it gets kind of loud. I'm for being practical, for building a city that's tidy, restrained in public ceremonies, promoting things that will ensure real human progress. Thirdly, I've grown tired of all the fighting that goes on in the name of the gods. So I just want a simple approach to life. How do I understand reality? Well, I understand reality as one. It's no different from the land of enchantment. It's just that it's not, it's a different one. It's material, it's physical. That's reality. It's what I see. What is unseen is the illusion, not what is seen. What is unseen is the invention. This includes the idea of a soul, as well as the idea that the world has a design. If you've listened to Dawkins, that's an illusion. Things in the world don't move, therefore, from higher to lower, but the other way around. We observe, right? We watch that lower forms develop into higher forms. Knowing, well, we know through the simple voice of reason, through investigation, through the scientific method. And our outlook is actually quite good. Because as long as we observe things carefully and we reason carefully and try to act responsibly so that life as we have it can be improved, made more equitable, and sustained as long as possible, is safeguarded. We're essentially able as a human race not only to understand the world around us, but to act and live well within it. Our only problem has to do with things that are out there, ignorance and superstition. So just a few questions, right, to put to the city of disenchantment. As humans, we have real trouble staying away from the gods and the mighty deeds normally attributed to a transcendent power. I don't know if you can see the words there, but they say, Lenin жил, Lenin жив, Lenin будет жить. And if you're a Christian, this is going to sound a little bit liturgical to you, right? Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Lenin lived, Lenin lives, Lenin will live on, right? So it's very hard to get away from a sense of trusting and relying on great leaders and of glorifying them. I remember visiting his tomb there in Red Square when I was studying, and he's basically made a something like a what's it called, a relic that you would venerate, right? There's continuity with the Russian past. It's not a radical break once you have the Soviet Union. I had one consistently communist friend when I studied there. And he never relaxed his commitment to communism. He would, every time he'd see me, he'd give me a new gift. It would be a record. You know, you remember what records are? He gave me a record of the Soviet national anthem, or he'd give me a printout of one of the latest party speeches or something. I don't know if he was tracking me or what, but he was a friend. And the only time he relaxed his high view of communism was when we traded our genes at the last day that I was in Russia. He wanted my genes, and I don't remember what I inherited, but anyway. So it's hard not to glorify great leaders, great events. It's hard not to glorify the nation. And but another question, where does our notion of equality come from? Is it any different from the idea of design in the universe? If design is inherently kind of suspicious because it implies a designer, what about equality? Does it imply a giver of order and equality, or what? Where does that come from? Can we live and act responsibly without borrowing one foundation or another? If we can't, then which one are we going to borrow? Normally, in the city of disenchantment, we promote a bare bones ethic. We say, don't hurt anyone and don't humiliate anyone. But that just begs the question, what is pain and what's it for? And then what do we do with the perennial questions about meaning and purpose and direction? Can I really find them in overfulfilling one more of Stalin's 5-year plans? The victory of the 5-year plan is a blow to capitalism, this poster says. Is the hope that my grandchildren will live into a worker's paradise a lasting hope? Now, granted that the Soviet experiment was not necessarily scientific materialism at its best, as people like Christopher Hitchens was apt to point out, atheistic nations have had real trouble thinking in anything other than collectivist terms, so that the individual gets lost in the group. And then from there, coercive means need to be instituted to keep everyone on track with the program. Another interesting thing is that over the Soviet years, the land of enchantment had to go underground. In extended visits back in Russia in the 90s, 93, 95, 96, Pandora's box came wide open. And I ended up renting a room in an apartment where my hostess was a medium, and she came back one night saying she'd just gone to cast a spell on some other house, and it just seemed like Pandora's box had opened up. Well, to conclude this first talk, and I think I'm just about there. As we think of the land of enchantment and the city of disenchantment together, a common problem emerges. Whether there's no God that speaks, as in the city of disenchantment, or no speech that's not God's, as in the land of enchantment, no speech that's not God's, as in the land of enchantment, we end up in the same place. We have no word from outside our own resources, no truth that is independent of human knowing. No truth that is independent of human knowing. We're with Tagore either way. Truth emerges from below, as I said. We invent it as we go along. This means, secondly, that the meaning of history is up for grabs. In the land of enchantment, we're not especially interested in history in any case, because the real action is going on behind history. Ravi Zacharias does a really good job of pointing this out in his little book where Jesus and Krishna have a conversation. It doesn't matter if Krishna or Hermes or Poseidon, take any god, whether he existed or not. That's not the point. Meaning in the land of enchantment is inward. It's not mediated by historical events. In the city of disenchantment, we can tell you all about how the world works, but not why it's there or where it's going, unless we import some other narrative. Ultimately, time and eternity are confused, and here I end. In the land of enchantment, time is collapsed into eternity. Eternity is real, but impersonal, timeless, and spaceless. I recall Chekhov commenting on Tolstoy's notion of the afterlife. He said, I have no use for his idea of the afterlife. You just get poured out into space. In the city of disenchantment, eternity is collapsed into time. So we feel compelled to come up with statements like, dear Uncle Tony will live forever in our hearts, or Lenin will live forever. And I'll stop there so that in part 2 we can start exploring what sort of relief we might find in the problem of God speaking in human history among the followers of the prophet. Thanks for listening.